morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome all out there in podcast land. Thank you for joining us after this episode. If you never heard of Hips News and you never had a chance to enjoy one of our episodes or podcasts, then you're in for a treat. This these next few episodes will definitely put us on the map. This special breaking episode has been long awaited, most requested, and most anticipated. Today, Vessel 2 and I, myself, Vessel 1, will take a look or a deep dive reveal Dr. Anthony Fauci. Yes, that's right. I said Dr. Fauci. Who is this individual? Why is he so important? Everything we'll look at from his career, his history, and allegations against this man. And what we will also do is speak on the book, The Real Dr. Anthony Fauci, and post and reveal a little bit of the Fauci dossier. I'm Vessel 1, and with me, Vessel 2. Vessel 2, how are you today?
Today's another day in the kingdom. All is well. Glad to be here, ready for this episode to take place. Everybody who's enjoying the dialogue that me and Vessel 1 have with each other, we appreciate you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in. Let's get into this episode.
Here.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, a key member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, has become a household name and the internet's new crush. Known for his ability to break down the science behind the disease for a wide audience, he is viewed as the most trusted voice by both Democrats and Republicans. So who is Dr. Fauci? Fauci was born on Christmas Eve in 1940 to Italian immigrant parents in New York. When he was a child, Fauci worked in a family-owned drugstore. At 5'7", Fauci was captain of his high school basketball team. He received his medical degree from Cornell University Medical College, where he graduated first in his class in 1966. Fauci started his long career at the National Institutes of Health in 1968. Over the next 5 decades, he steadily climbed up the ladder to become the nation's leading expert on infectious disease. In 1984, he became the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, a position he still holds today. During his tenure, Fauci has served 6 presidents and worked to battle AIDS, SARS, Ebola, Zika, and the coronavirus. Fauci first stepped into the public eye during the AIDS epidemic in the late 1980s. As the LGBTQ community became increasingly frustrated by government inaction and public apathy, Fauci, then a government spokesperson, became a target of activists. However, when protesters stormed the NIH building, Fauci surprised everyone by inviting them into his office. He ended up working with activists and adopted their idea of parallel track, an approach that expanded access to promising new drugs.
I consider Fauci one of the great heroes.
Now, with 3 decades of experience combating infectious diseases, Fauci has become the one person the public turns to for fact-based analyses during this pandemic. He has also been a blunt voice.
It is a failing. I mean, let's admit it. Things will get worse before they get better.
Occasionally contradicting the president.
The evidence that you're talking about, John, is anecdotal evidence.
When asked how he managed to not get fired, Fauci said, even though we disagree on some things, he listens.
The idea of just pitting one against the other is just not helpful.
At 79, Fauci is known to be a workaholic even by Washington standards. He used to run 7 miles a day, but had to cut it down to 3.5 miles during the epidemic. When asked about the recent threats he's received, Fauci simply said, it's my job. This is the life I've chosen, and I'm doing it.
Okay, so when I came down to the NIH after my residency in 1968, it was a period of time when we were just starting to get insight about the human immune system. It was an infant field. It wasn't what it is now with all the technologies that we have. And I had this dual interest of infectious diseases and the immune system and how the immune system responds. And I was fascinated by the intricacies of how the immune system was regulated. And because I became interested in that, even though I was clinically, fundamentally an infectious disease person, I kind of switched my interest, not giving up the interest in infectious diseases, about studying is how the immune system is regulated. And there are a number of diseases of hyperactivation of the immune system, referred to as autoinflammatory or autoimmune diseases. 2 or 3 in particular were very lethal, with almost 100% mortality. One was called, it used to be called Wegener's granulomatosis, now it's called granulomatosis with vasculitis. Strange names, not rare but unusual diseases, polyarteritis nodosa, some of the other autoimmune diseases. And some of them were highly lethal. You would get pulmonary failure, you would get renal failure, and the patients would die. And since I was interested in the immune system, I was saying, is there any way that we can suppress the immune system enough to suppress the disease, but not enough to make a person susceptible to the secondary infections you get when you knock out someone's immune system? So, for example, the drugs that we used for cancer, cyclophosphamide, a variety of other drugs, when given to people who have cancer, you want to completely kill all the cells. The problem is those people are susceptible then to a lot of things like infections and bleeding because platelets go low. So when I came to the NIH, I had a mentor named Sheldon Wolf, who was an amazing person in that he gave me, at a very young age, a group of patients to work with him and figure out how we can study them. And it happened that in the National Cancer Institute, which was 2 floors away from us in the old building, where I would go up there all the time as the infectious diseases consult because they were getting immunosuppressed and they were getting infections. And when you look at the drugs that they were being treated with, they were being treated with massive doses of these cytotoxic drugs. So we got the idea that if we could somehow give a cancer drug at a low enough dose, but monitor the immune function and the white cell function of the people enough to kind of titrate the dose, could you turn the disease off without any of the secondary complications? And we did.
At the October 13, 1988 presidential debate, Michael Dukakis and George H.W. Bush were asked,
who are the heroes who are there in American life today? Who are the ones that you would point out to young Americans as figures who should inspire this country?
Vice President Bush eventually responded with,
I think of Dr. Fauci. Probably never heard of him. You did, and heard him. He's a very fine research, top doctor at National Institute of Health, working hard doing something about research on this disease of AIDS.
Today, Dr. Anthony S. Fauci is best known because of his position in the coronavirus task force and for his many media appearances. In the US, he's one of the most recognizable faces in the current crisis. How did this doctor go from his research lab in Bethesda, Maryland, to becoming one of the most visible medical experts on the pandemic today?
Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for taking the time.
Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Anthony Fauci.
The June 5th, 1981 weekly report by the Centers for Disease Control was a notable one. It recorded 5 unusual cases of pneumonia. These cases would become known as some of the earliest reports of AIDS. The next year, Dr. Anthony Fauci wrote an early paper about the disease, which had increased to 290 recognized cases and had become a public health problem of essentially epidemic proportions. Fauci worked at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, heading up a lab that studied immune system response. NIAID conducts research on diseases to help understand, treat, and prevent them. It falls under the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, the medical research agency part of the Department of Health and Human Services. In the early 80s, the NIH had many institutes, with NIAID and National Cancer Institute leading investigation of the new virus and disease that would become known as HIV/AIDS. Fauci made that investigation the focus of his career.
Today
we're going to be listening to Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's going to be talking about AIDS.
I'm working directly on AIDS, both clinically and from a basic science standpoint. That really is one of the few, or actually one of the only subjects where you really have to change your lecture every month.
Fauci was named director of NIAID in 1984, and the then director of Health and Human Services highlighted Fauci's background in immunology and infectious diseases as a main reason for his appointment.
A major effort was directed at determining if a variant of this virus could actually cause depletion of lymphocytes or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And as it turned out, a variant of that virus, in fact, caused the syndrome.
Fauci's leading early research helped define NIAID as the Central NIH Institute for AIDS, and he made it a point to be the person communicating key findings to the public and media.
The scientific data is overwhelming that, in fact, AIDS cannot be transmitted by casual contact.
But it was a later political test that shows how Fauci navigated the AIDS crisis and secured his career. In the summer of 1988, playwright Larry Kramer wrote an open letter to Anthony Fauci, calling him an incompetent idiot and a murderer. His opinion was broadly reflective of activists, most notably the organization Kramer inspired, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP. In 1986, Fauci had reinforced his position as the leading scientist for the federal AIDS effort. He created a new division to focus on the disease and earned other significant NIH posts. But progress was slow, especially for a disease as deadly as AIDS, where patients died, on average, 15 months after diagnosis. Fauci and NIAID were responsible for starting trials for new drugs, which the FDA required for approval. In June 1986, NIAID created a network of clinical trial centers around the country, though they were criticized as ineffective. Activists argued that the NIH, the FDA, and leadership up to President Reagan had failed to take the crisis seriously. This photo from an October 1988 protest shows the key complaints. At the time, the FDA's lengthy drug approvals required strict scientific clinical trials. It was textbook science, but the disease killed at a faster pace than the FDA's process. If you entered a trial, a certain percentage of patients got the drug and a certain percentage got a placebo. This helped test if the drugs were safe and if they really worked. That was important because many AIDS drugs didn't pan out. But with AIDS, getting a placebo was a death sentence. And that meant fewer volunteers for clinical trials. The epidemic needed a radical approach, but experimental approaches like aerosolized pentamidine weren't being approved. The drug helped treat one of the most common infections caused by AIDS, yet trials had been delayed by NIAID, which Fauci blamed on insufficient staff. Under pressure, he acknowledged the approval problem in 1988. Testifying in Congress that he would go for what is available on the street if he were a patient, a blunt rebuke to FDA policy keeping these new approaches out of reach. Fauci also went on to admit that it took them a long time to start trials of dextrans sulfate, a drug that had early enthusiasm among AIDS patients. For the few approved options, like the then promising drug AZT, activists criticized the high prices charged by maker Burroughs Wellcome. All these issues had spawned large networks of buyers clubs, AIDS patients who pooled their resources to import non-FDA approved drugs. In 1990, activists staged another major protest, this time at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland, where Fauci worked. It was a turning point. In two key ways, Fauci incorporated these sharp activist criticisms and ideas into the government response. In 1990, NIAID invited activist representatives into the administrative committees for every AIDS clinical trial group. This allowed for the government response to include on-the-ground knowledge. Starting in 1989, Fauci had also voiced support for a new program called Parallel Track, forcing the FDA to consider it. In it, patients who couldn't participate in clinical trials could still get unapproved drugs once they'd been tested for basic safety. Even if some drugs didn't work, at least they would be available to try. The day ACT UP stormed the NIH in May 1990, the Federal Register published the FDA's plans to adopt a parallel track plan. 2 decades ago, Fauci was already the face of public health response to unusual diseases. That included everything from anthrax and flu updates to running the US government's massive AIDS treatment program in Africa under President George W. Bush. All that's helped his relationship with activists. Fauci called Larry Kramer a dear friend who was a longtime nemesis. I remember he wanted to get my attention by writing an open letter to that incompetent idiot, Dr. Tony Fauci. He needed to stir the pot. By staying in the same role at NIAID since 1984, Fauci became a fixture across 5 NIH directors, 8 Centers for Disease Control directors, and 8 Surgeons General. They're appointed by the president, and Fauci's been around for 6 of them. As the director of NIAID, he's insulated from that political element. The AIDS response in particular illustrates how Fauci manages stakeholders from inside and outside the government, and from above and below his position. That and his scientific expertise has made him a constant during a new crisis, too.
Our recent advances of being able to isolate, identify, and characterize the agent, together with the advances in understanding the natural history and pathophysiology of this disease, will allow us over the next year to come back to you and tell you that we now not only have hope and hypothesis, but that we have a real prevention and indeed a real cure. Thank you.
So, too, what say you about Dr. Anthony Fauci so far of what we've been viewing? Is history getting to know or getting to see the man of Dr. Fauci, whom he, a shadow of his character. How do you feel thus far?
I say that he keeps himself busy. Yeah, they claim to he was a workaholic. It seems like he has managed to get himself in a position to where he's buffered and everything kind of filters through him. And it seems like I think it was in his high school. He was playing basketball, right? Captain of the team.
Yes.
So that role has this kind of been his life. It seems like it went from being the captain of the basketball team to everything that he got himself into. He just kind of wanted to make sure he was in control of.
Right.
Good or bad.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it's interesting how he got the government to actually listen to the people.
Right.
Which is good. But I mean, I don't know if some of his doings as far as the manipulations worked in his favor. But yeah, he's a character, to say the least. How about you? What are your thoughts so far? What do you got to say about Mr. Fauci?
Well, I mean, straight out the gate, Dr. Fauci, he's been in this, medical field or the medical system for a very long time. And as you can see, he's been with, I think they said 6 presidents, but I believe it's now seven presidents, if I'm not mistaken, including our President Biden. And with that length of time, that's a little bit over 40 some odd years, 50, almost 50 years. and he's at the age of, if not mistaken, 78, 79, almost 80 years old. And just like you mentioned, um, of course, like anything, there's no such thing as 100% science in that sense. There is, the mathematics, it has, theories and so on and so forth must take precedence as well, and learning and um, adjusting certain things. But it looks like even in the beginning, there was a lot of uh, somewhat shortcomings or taking shortcuts and trying to get things done. Even with the start of this AIDS epidemic that happened in the early 80s, mid 80s, and 90s. And it seems like there wasn't enough information, let alone enough research done to see how that they could manage this uh, disease. Um, I believe that also um, being more empathetic to the patient was something that they overlooked, even as Dr. Fauci himself said that the presidents at that time didn't take it seriously. And so that's a very daunting and frightening statement, um, coming from the man in charge of the medical system. I mean, this guy, he was in charge of like 5, 6 different operations, and you would think that, you know, with his status and his understanding, that you would be more careful about producing and getting things correctly done. So all this is stood out, and I mean, this is just, you know, the beginning of getting to know his career, the person, Fauci, and the things that or action he has done or taken, the steps that he's taken in his position. But I noticed another thing I noticed is that he also used very similar words even up until this modern time of this recent pandemic. He using words like placebo, variant, and of course his very obsession with the immune system and how to suppress different things. So again, yeah, this is only the beginning, and this is interesting thus far. Do you have any additional commentary, Russell, too?
Yeah, I kind of see what you're talking about as far as how there's really no accountability.
Exactly.
And he pretty much, he'll tell you about it, but still nothing holds feet to the fire. It's interesting
Right.
how some people get away with almost blatant murder.
It seems like it, right?
I mean, that's what the man printed on the paper and called him out as a murderer.
And that was way back when,
Right. And then,
so,
they become best friends, or they already are friends. Right. But I don't know. It's his side of the story, and then other sides of the story. It just seems like he's been able to manage to to be in the limelight, but to stay out of trouble.
Exactly.
As he said, he was the face of the organization, and I think that was pretty much his goal. But yeah, okay, keep it moving.
I think it's important and appropriate to reflect back to that classic meeting in San Francisco in 1990 for a number of reasons, because it was between the time when the first drug, AZT, was approved in 1987 and when 1996, when we had the development of the triple combination cocktail, which has completely transformed the lives of HIV-infected individuals. So what we were talking about then was the fact that we had treatments that seemed to help a bit. We were dealing with single and double drugs, but not yet the famous cocktail that is now used, where you can get a single pill that would contain 3 or more drugs in most cases. So it was a very interesting year. It was the height of the interaction between the activist community and the establishment of scientists and regulators. I remember I gave a keynote address, and Peter Staley, who now 30 years later has become a very close personal friend of mine, gave a very stirring keynote address about the importance of paying attention to activists. And if you fast forward 30 years from that 1990 meeting till now, we have people who were activists at the time that are now actually full colleagues that are integrated into everything that we do, from the research agenda to the conduct of clinical trials to the interpretation of the data. So that has been an amazing evolution from that. The other thing that is amazing in its evolution was the amount that we've learned about HIV pathogenesis, the reservoir, the potential for controlling the virus, either in the absence of antiretroviral or in a modified regimen that takes away the need to have a single pill or multiple pills every single day. The thing that remains, the holy grail of unaccomplished goals, is the development of a highly effective, safe, and effective vaccine. And that is something that's not surprising because of the very special situation with HIV, that the body, as much as we studied pathogenesis and understand it so incredibly well, the body does not make an adequate immune response against HIV, which is the reason why no one has yet spontaneously cleared the virus by their immune system. And so what we need to do, and what we're combination putting a lot of effort into, but also struggling with, is the issue of the development of a vaccine that would be effective enough to be able to be deployed. We have one situation that took place well after that meeting in San Francisco, where a trial of a candidate vaccine in a trial named RV144 that took place in Thailand showed a 31% efficacy, which gave us some great hints of correlates of immunity and on the basis for a number of subsequent trials, but still was not good enough to deploy. So we have a number of very large vaccine trials going on now throughout the world, including a heavy concentration in Southern Africa. But we also are pursuing another line of vaccine research, which is the attempt to present to the body in the proper conformation with sequential immunizations the capability of making broadly neutralizing antibodies. And if we're successful in that, then I think we have a really good chance of developing a vaccine that would have an efficacy and safety profile good enough to actually deploy it. We have a variety of very, very good preventive measures now that we did not have in 1990. Just think, that was 30 years ago. and the prevention was mostly behavioral issues and condoms and things like that. Right now, the pre-exposure prophylaxis, either with a pill that you take every day like Truvada, which is a combination of tenofovir and M-tricytidine, or what we're working on now, and data that came out literally, I think, a week or two ago, showing that an injectable form of a drug called cabotegravir, which when given every couple of months, can actually prevent the acquisition of HIV in people at risk, as well as, or maybe even a little better, but certainly as well as Truvada can. So if you look at what's happened since that meeting, we have therapies now that can bring a person's viral load to below detectable in a sustained way. An offshoot of that is not only saving the lives of countless individuals, but the concept that was never spoken of back in 1990, what's part of our lexicon right now, is the issue of treatment as prevention, or U equals U. Namely, if you are undetectable and your viral load is beyond or beneath the level of detection by classical assays, that makes it essentially impossible to transmit the virus to another individual. So if you look at all those things that we didn't have when I was given that plenary address in San Francisco and Peter Staley was given his plenary address, and then Secretary of HHS Louis Sullivan was up there getting condoms thrown at him from the audience, that took place in 1992. We didn't have therapy that was effective. We didn't have treatment as prevention and U equals U. We didn't have exquisitely effective pre-exposure prophylaxis, and we didn't have a vaccine. Of all of that, the things that we don't have still are a vaccine, and we're trying for a cure, but a cure is going to be problematic. A cure means that you essentially eradicate the virus, which we have not been able to do, or suppress it in a way that doesn't require daily antiretroviral drugs. So the two remaining challenges, if we were having the meeting now in San Francisco, we're going to be having it virtually, is where are we on the road to a cure, and where are we on the road to a vaccine?
Sound like where he was talking about current day 2022.
Right?
I mean, they got a vaccine, but a lot of insufficiencies surrounding the vaccines, and it's still unclear whether or not the vaccines, what's not unclear is their narrative, hint, the word narrative, has changed regarding the vaccine. It's not necessarily going to prevent anything that's well established now, so they don't claim that anymore. But originally, it was supposed to prevent you from catching the virus.
Right.
And they are now working on possibly a fourth one. I don't know how they're going to label it, but a fourth shot. So they've had 2 shots, then a booster. So this fourth shot, I don't know what term they're going to call it, but there's talks about a 4th shot coming around. So
right.
Yeah. Okay. So he's got a vaccine now. He's still the face of everything that's going on. He's been silent here lately. I'm kind of speechless. I don't know how come he's still out and about. But what about you? Anything else you got to say about Mr. Fauci before we move on to the next clip?
Well, the thing that stood out with me, again, like before, and he was talking about since 1981, right? And he had problems trying to find solutions or curable medicines or supplements or whatever the case may be to correct HIV. Now, that, as you can see, that's been since '81. But somehow, miraculously, you have a vaccine that supposedly magically take out COVID, or at least maintain it to the point where it's sustainable. And there have been several videos that he came out when he said that it's not working. And then even you just mentioned it. You said that the president of Moderna is now pushing for a fourth booster shot. So which one is it? I mean, if you can't manage something since '81, HIV, and you now have something that's supposed to take care of this pandemic, what's the difference? Because they're basically both immune disorder, as the words that they use, the immune disorder diseases. Am I right? And he's is in charge of the disease and bio uh, agenda. He's in charge of it all. So that's my biggest question. You can take care of COVID, but you're still having problems with HIV. Okay.